Telesur, I'm Carla Gonzalez in Quito, and this is from the South. Let's begin with our first story. The candidate for president under Bolivia's movement towards socialism has traveled to Buenos Aires, Argentina, to meet with former President Evo Morales. National and departmental leaders of the MAS also traveled for the meeting in the Argentine capital, which will lay out plans for the electoral campaign as a number of movement leaders remain in exile. A new poll released by private company Unitel shows Luis Arce in the lead nationally and in 5 of 9 departments among voters. Freddy Morales in La Paz has the latest on the Bolivian election.
Bolivia is awaiting a decision by the Supreme Electoral Court regarding the enabling of Evo Morales as candidate for Senate in the department of Cochabamba. The court announced that this Monday a new list of enabled candidates would be published, which is to include the case of Evo Morales and other candidates of the movement towards socialism, including Luis Arce, the candidate for presidency. Expectations are even higher because the civic committees of Santa Cruz and La Paz, the Union Federation of Chuquisaca, the candidates of the right wing and the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, which participated in the November coup, are campaigning and pressuring so that Evo Morales is disqualified from running as candidate. Private media has published the results of a new voter intention survey, which shows MAS candidate Luis Arce in the lead with 31%. Nearly double that of second-place candidate in the poll, Carlos Mesa, with 17%, and which shows Janine Áñez in third place with 16%. That result generated an extreme reactivation of the campaign against the MAS, as well as calls for the unity of far-right-wing candidates to, quote, save the country and democracy.
That was Freddy Morales from La Paz. Also in Bolivia, residents of the city of Sacaba, Cochabamba, marked 3 months since the massacre of November 15th against community members who protested against the coup, which took out President Evo Morales. Families and residents gathered to mark the day when 9 men were killed by the military in one single operation. The residents staged a protest on the main road connecting the city of Cochabamba to the Chapare province. Leaders of the movement towards socialism were in attendance, and the victims were remembered as martyrs who were killed in defense of Bolivian democracy. Protests and candlelight vigils were held in several cities, including Santo Domingo Este and Villa Progreso, following the announcement of the suspension of municipal elections in the Dominican Republic on Sunday. Citizens protested and burned tires in rejection of the decision. Political parties are demanding that all members of the electoral body resign. According to the president of the electoral body, Julio César Castaños, more than half of the electronic devices used in the nationwide election did not work properly. He said the elections will be rescheduled to a later date. Let's turn to our correspondent, Daisy Toussaint, who has more.
The suspension of the municipal elections yesterday marked a historic event in the Dominican Republic. Tensions arose since the moment when the Central Electoral Board suspended the process for the irregularities within the electoral system. Some of the neighborhoods of the country held demonstrations which resulted in the death of 1 person and at least 11 people were injured. The automated vote was implemented in 18 of the 158 municipalities of the country. The manual vote was carried out with normality while the automated system failed to show some of the candidates, all of them from the opposition. This alarmed voters and, of course, the opponent candidates who feared a possible fraud situation and began to call for the suspension of the elections. The Central Electoral Board suspended the process, generating the crisis where things are murky at the moment, and that is why they're asking for an investigation to see if it was a technical mistake or if it was provoked. President Danilo Medina is set to speak tonight to address what's occurring. On Sunday evening, political and social organizations held a vigil in front of the Central Electoral Board asking for the resignation of their members. Former president and leader of the Fuerza del Pueblo party, Leonel Fernandez, said that this was a criminal plot against the Dominican people and it's a tragedy without precedence for the Dominican democracy.
That was Daisy Toussaint from the Dominican Republic. Now we turn to Venezuela. Nicolás Maduro, and were intended to strengthen the civic-military union. This in the context of the recent approval of a new law which incorporates the Bolivarian civilian militia as a component of the military. Missile air defense and terrestrial systems were tested in areas which included the Colombian border region. President Maduro has argued that the strengthening of the territorial defense is critical, given the ongoing attempts by the United States to intervene in the country's internal affairs.
This tests out the levels that we have reached for preparation in defense of the country. Incredible. I'm amazed by the exercise of command and control, which is the capacity to communicate, to lead, to conduct, and through distinct coding, signals, messages, means of communication. The level that the Bolivarian militia has reached is impressive, to complement the rest of the Bolivarian National Armed Forces. For that reason, we are glad that this component of the militia has been incorporated into the Bolivarian National Armed Forces. With this will be impenetrable, as our commander Chavez would say. The city is impenetrable, the people impenetrable, our geographic space is impenetrable, the homeland impenetrable.
Brazilian truckers have staged early morning demonstrations at Latin America's largest port in Santos, demanding a reduction of ICMS tax on gasoline and diesel. No roadblocks were reported so far, but the protests came after the right-wing government sent a bill to Congress aiming to change the tax. ICMS is a tax on sales and services and applies to the movement of goods, transportation, communication, services, and other supplies. The price of diesel is a sensitive issue for truck drivers, whose national strike in 2018 had a large impact on Brazil's economy. Now to the Caribbean. Aruba's Justice Minister Andine Bicker has denied reports that aviation authorities in that country have intercepted and confiscated a Venezuelan plane carrying 900 kilograms of gold. Bicker said the story carried by media outlets was false. The head of the Caribbean nation's aviation authority also denied reports by these outlets. Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has cancelled his trip to the Caribbean amid protests held by Indigenous people and allies against a planned pipeline project. Trudeau was expected to fly to Barbados on Monday to speak at the two-day meeting of CARICOM heads of government, where he intended to advocate for a seat at the UN Security Council. However, concerns were raised that he would attempt to divide the region amid similar efforts by the US government. Justin Trudeau will be represented by the Foreign Affairs Minister. And Trudeau is facing growing pressure as Indigenous peoples protest the construction of the coastal gas link pipeline that will run through Wet'suwet'en territory. Land defenders and other demonstrators shut down one of Canada's busiest rail corridors over the weekend. On Saturday, Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller met with the Tien-Dinaga Mohawk First Nation and described the situation as highly volatile. More than 24 people were arrested in early February following similar protests. And earlier we were joined by Montreal-based journalist and editor of Ricochet Media, Ethan Cox, who detailed the persecution of Indigenous peoples at the hands of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
The government's big fear in these type of situations is that the First Nations will generate public sympathy. And I think that's certainly what we've seen happening over the last week, with literally hundreds of solidarity demonstrations, actions, blockades of rail lines, this type of thing in response to a raid on all of these sites, on First Nations people. You know, basically what happened is tactical units with the federal police force went in, arrested and removed First Nations people from their own territory. And that has generated a groundswell of opposition in Canada.
And he also hit back at claims that Indigenous peoples were illegally protesting since a court injunction granted construction workers access to their lands.
What we hear a lot from politicians here in Canada is that the rule of law has to be respected. And when they say that, they're talking about an injunction issued by a lower court. But our Supreme Court actually found in a 1997 decision that the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are the rightful title holders in that area. And of course, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which British Columbia adopted into law last year, demands free, prior, and informed consent before putting a resource project like this through, which obviously hasn't happened. So when we talk about the rule of law, it is perhaps more on the side of the Wet'suwet'en than it is on the government. But that's not something we see reflected in media coverage, which often focuses on the injunction.
And Cox said there was a crisis as it relates to press freedom in covering this issue.
We've had something of a crisis of press freedom happening in Canada over the course of these raids. On Thursday, when they raided the first site, journalist Jesse Winter with Vice News and another journalist were detained, removed from the area. There was a huge outcry over that, and as a result, the RCMP said, no, we're going to allow journalists to stay. We're going to allow them to report. Contrary to that, when they arrived at the Gdimkin checkpoint, they detained our journalist, held him for 8 hours, put him in a ditch where he was unable to report properly on what was going on, unable to see everything that was going on. And then didn't allow him to continue on to the Unistoten camp or to move anywhere except to leave. And then we saw a similar sort of thing in the raid on Unistoten on Monday, where several journalists who were embedded there were held in one location by the RCMP. There have been other threats of arrest made against journalists. So we've had a situation where across the board media outlets trying to be there for these raids, trying to cover these nonviolent expressions have been restricted from doing their job by the RCMP, and that assault on press freedom has been denounced by virtually every major international press freedom group, including the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, and Amnesty International.
Coming up, residents of Aleppo, Syria celebrate the liberation of their city. More details when we come back.
A review of the world news that investigates, incites analysis, and induces criticism, because every event has a context.
Pusimos el punto en él.
Dotting the I. Saturdays, only on Telesur.
Innovation, science, the technological breakthrough, and its influence in society.
Viajeros del saber, el futuro está aquí.
Atomen. Monday, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. More news at this hour. Syrian government forces have made significant advances in their military offensive against the last major rebel stronghold, taking over at least 23 villages west of Aleppo. According to state television, the Russian-backed forces have liberated all the villages and small towns west of Aleppo city. The latest advances come after the government forces drove rebel fighters from the key M5 highway linking Aleppo to the capital, Damascus, and thus reopening the fastest route between Syria's two biggest cities, waving national flags and chanting slogans supporting the army and President Bashar al-Assad. And on Monday, President al-Assad congratulated the heroic Syrian Arab army for their successful liberation of the city of Aleppo. He said the victory is a symbol of the Syrian people's will to defend and protect their homeland.
Thus, the battle to liberate the countryside of Aleppo and Idlib continues, regardless of some empty voices coming from the north, as does the battle to liberate all Syrian soil, to crush terrorism and to achieve stability. We all triumphed over the fear that they tried to sow in our hearts. We triumphed over the delusions that they tried to instill in our minds. We triumphed over disintegration, over hatred, over betrayal, and over everyone who represents, carries, and practices these attributes.
Meanwhile, Syria's transit on Wednesday morning from Damascus. It will be the first time a civilian aircraft lands at the airport since the war forced its closure in 2012. And Al-Assad also received an Iranian delegation headed by Speaker of Parliament Ali Larijani. During the meeting, President Al-Assad hailed the strong bilateral ties between the two countries, which have helped them defeat Western-sponsored armed groups that have been destabilizing the region. For his part, Larijani affirmed Tehran's continued support to Damascus' efforts to stop the spreading of chaos and destabilization pursued by some Western countries led by the United States. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani says the Donald Trump's administration's so-called maximum pressure campaign has failed to break the Iranian revolution.
Despite what the ill-wishers want, our problems this year are less than last year, and despite the fact that conditions are tougher than last year. All social, security and economic indices show that the United States' maximum pressure has failed and is now behind us. There is no doubt that Americans have come to the conclusion today that the path and strategy they had chosen was based on a miscalculation and will not affect the great Iranian nation.
February 17th marks 9 years since former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown and killed by rebels supported by the U.S. President Barack Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, along with their NATO allies. 9 years down the line, the people of Libya are yet to see the freedom and democracy that NATO promised them. The once prosperous nation has plunged into chaos and bloodshed, with different warlords and militias vying for the control of the country. The country that was once at the center of Pan-African unity has become an open-air slave market with black Africans sold for as little as $400. Relatives of the victims of Sudan's Darfur War have welcomed the decision by the transitional government to hand over former President Omar al-Bashir to the ICC to face genocide and war crime charges. The family said the handing over of al-Bashir to the Hague-based court is a victory for the victims of the brutal war. Al-Bashir is facing 3 counts of genocide, 5 counts of crimes against humanity, and 2 counts of war crimes perpetrated by government forces and allied militias during the Darfur War between 2003 and 2008.
The handing over of Bashir is a victory for the victims, a victory for all the Sudanese people, and a warning for any other person to not repeat the same actions.
After this break, China says they could be dealing with an effective treatment for COVID-19 virus. So stay with us for more.
Innovation, science, the technological breakthrough, and its influence in society.
Viajeros del saber, el futuro está aquí.
Atomen. Monday, only on Telesur.
A review of the world news that investigates, incites analysis, and induces criticism, because every event has a context.
Pusimos el punto en la I.
Dot in the Eye. Saturdays, only on Telesur.
Thank you for joining us again. Let's continue. Members of the Economic Community of West African States are meeting in Burkina Faso to find a solution to Nigeria's refusal to rescind its decision to close its borders. In August last year, Nigeria imposed a ban on the movement of goods from neighboring countries, allegedly to curb smuggling. The move was strongly condemned by ECOWAS, who says it goes against the principles of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Abuja has, however, insisted that it will not reopen the borders until its concerns are addressed. South Africa's ruling party, the African National Congress, has condemned claims by former President Frederick de Klerk that apartheid was not a crime against humanity. The ANC said de Klerk's conduct is an attempt to whitewash the brutal apartheid system. Last week, de Klerk claimed that the classification of apartheid as a crime against humanity by the United Nations back in 1973 was part of an agenda by the Soviet Union and the ANC to stigmatize white South Africans. China's National Health Commission says it has found an effective combination of drugs for the treatment of the COVID-19 virus. The Commission's deputy director told journalists on Monday that doctors discovered that chloroquine phosphate, an anti-malarial drug, can be effectively used to cure mild cases of the virus. She added that as of Sunday, more than 10,000 patients have been successfully treated and discharged from health facilities. China has been racing to contain the outbreak that has so far killed 1,765 people and infected more than 70,000 worldwide.
Our answer is clear. Although it is a new infection disease, it is controllable and curable. According to the latest data as of Sunday, more than 10,000 were cured and discharged from hospitals. Early diagnosis and early treatment are very effective ways to improve the cure rate. We also analyze our patients' treatment. More than 90% of the patients received antiviral treatment and symptomatic treatment. We enhanced their immunity and provided breathing and circulation support. Such therapies have accelerated patients' recovery. The situation in Wuhan improved a lot. By early diagnosis and treatment and continuous observation of patients with mild symptoms, we can see the proportion of critical cases has dropped from 38% to 18%.
The Israeli Air Force has carried out airstrikes on the besieged Gaza Strip. Local media reports say fighter jets and helicopters on Sunday evening bombed several sites south of the city of Deir al-Balah, causing damage to homes and public buildings. The Israeli military claimed that the raids were in response to the firing of 2 projectiles from the besieged enclave. No injuries have been reported so far. And since it's already Carnival in Latin America, in most places at least, we leave you with a presentation by La Gran Muñeca during Uruguay's Carnival, with a song on how poverty is growing in most countries under right-wing governments. So until next time.
Llegamos al carnaval para defender la tierra. Llegamos al carnaval, hoy América despierta. Pueblos originarios que se juntaron para luchar contra los dictadores evangelistas de Donald Trump. Este es nuestro lugar y tenemos que cuidarlo. Nadie nos podrá callar. Suena fuerte nuestro canto. Somos la patria grande y ahora nadie nos va a parar. Entre todas y todos el continente resistirá. Macri ya no está más, que la gente no se olvide, que le gusta reprimir, igual que Piñera en Chile. Afuera Bolsonaro con su racismo que nos asusta. gusta. Fuera la vieja cheta que está en